Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Fortson. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I teach legal studies in the Justice Center. And on behalf of the Justice Center, we are very happy to be co-hosting today's symposium with the Alaska Law Review and the Alaska Native Law section of the Alaska Bar Association. The symposium for today is Adapting for the Next Generation, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act at 45. This is the second time that we've done a symposium with the Alaska Law Review, and I recognize some faces from 2 years ago that came to the last symposium. And we're very happy to have this partnership. We're very happy that the Alaska Law Review is willing to publish the papers that are being presented today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will Robinson, who is, I'm not sure your position with the Alaska Law Review, but he can tell you, and he's going to say a few words, and then we'll get on very quickly to the keynote speaker.
Thanks. I'm Will Robinson. I'm a student at Duke Law, and I'm one of the editors of the Alaska Law Review. And we're really excited to have you all here for our symposium today. And we've got a big group of our students here in Anchorage and a few in Juneau as well, so they've had the chance to explore the state and meet with members of the bar. And we're always looking to meet new people or publish articles, so if anyone has any ideas on topics we should cover or wants to write for us, we'd love to talk to you. So with that, we really look forward to the symposium today, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Will. When we were thinking of topics for the symposium, the 45th anniversary of the passage of ANCSA seemed like a good fit, but we decided we didn't want necessarily a retrospective of the last 45 years, but rather we wanted to spur some thought about issues that are still present, issues that still need to be resolved. And we came up with two topics, two main panels when we were coming up with this, one on jurisdiction issues. As I'm sure all of you know, there have been a lot of cases and legislation that have moved that issue forward, but there's still a lot that remains to be done. And similarly with corporate issues, there are still a lot of unresolved issues involving Alaska Native corporations. So we structured the symposium to have two panels with that, and then we reached out to the Alaska Native Law section and said, hey, could you help us think of some people who might help populate these panels? And they said, sure, not only are we willing to do that, but we would like to partner with you to present our 32nd annual Alaska Native Law Conference. And we said, wow, that's a great idea. And so they're going to be doing their conference in the afternoon. Hopefully all of you will be able to stay for that. And one of the co-chairs of the Alaska Native Law section is Bruce Anders, who's with Siri. He's going to say a few words, and he's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Well, thanks, everybody, for joining here today. A nice crisp fall morning. Should be winter, but still fall, I guess. As Ryan said, the Alaska Native Law section, we normally have our annual conference at this time of the year, but we thought it'd be a nice way to coalesce these two events and have it all in one. So hopefully that'll work out, and maybe it'll even send a trend for the future. But let's try and stay roughly on schedule for the day so that we can hear all of the great things we're going to hear from our speakers. And so at this time, we're going to be introducing our keynote speaker. I am honored and very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Raina Thiele. And with a fairly extraordinary travel schedule to and from D.C. from Alaska, I'm somewhat amazed that we actually landed her. So on to the more formal introduction. Raina served in President Obama's White House for 7 years, most recently as Associate Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, where she focused on tribal governments and advised on climate change, Arctic, and energy issues. She was a lead organizer of President Obama's trip to Alaska in the fall of 2015, which all of us remember and were quite excited about, especially my boys who saw him at Snow City and thought that was the coolest thing ever. Previous to her role in the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, Raina served for nearly 5 years with the White House Office of Management and Budget, where she worked on a variety of issues, including tribal legislation and the federal budget for international affairs and clean energy. She managed a multi-billion-dollar federal portfolio and advised senior White House staff on how to best leverage and allocate resources. Since departing the White House, Raina launched her own consulting service, Thiele Strategies, LLC, which advises clients on a variety of issues related to federal policy, tribal affairs, federal budgeting, Arctic issues, renewable energy and the environment, public relations, and strategic alliances. And good luck fending off the efforts of the incoming Clinton administration to grab you back, Raina. But good luck with your consulting efforts, nonetheless. In her spare time, Raina serves on the Victory Leaders Council for the Hillary for America campaign in Alaska, as well as leader and advisor on tribal national policy related to Native youth. Raina earned her bachelor's degree in political science from Yale College and her master's in public policy degree from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Raina was born and raised in Alaska in the Mat-Su Valley, Kenai Peninsula, Bristol Bay, and Alexander Creek. She was brought up commercial subsistence and sport fishing with her parents, subsistence hunting and picking berries. She is a Dena'ina Athabascan, Yupik, and German. She currently resides between Washington, D.C. And Alaska. And anecdotally, I was just in chatting with Raina last week, I can say that in addition to all those astonishing professional credentials, she's just pretty cool. When she was talking about how she was back in D.C. organizing the White House Tribal Government Conference and was sort of off in the wings, watching things transpire as an anxious organizer does. And someone sidles up next to her and thanks her for the excellent work she did in organizing it, and congratulates her on a successful program. And of course, she looks over and it's the president, which is pretty cool. For her, it's just sort of another day, but for the rest of us, I just thought that's pretty neat. And so, with that, it's with great pleasure that I present to you the homegrown right here in our backyard, the highly distinguished and credentialed, but also extraordinarily cool Raina Thiele.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that introduction. Wow. It's way too kind, way too kind. First, I just want to say thank you so much to Bruce for kind of being the one to ask me to speak at this conference in the first place. And also thank you to the organizers of the conference for allowing me to be here today. It's a huge honor. It really is to be here. You know, in my work for the federal government over the past 7.5 years, a lot of what I do is work with attorneys. I myself am not an attorney, so I'm probably one of the few in this room, actually. But I've worked so closely with attorneys over the past 7 years that I have this very distinct understanding of how important all of your work is to our federal government, to our policy making. I mean, being at the White House, you really couldn't publish maybe even a single paragraph without first getting it approved by our lawyers. And if there's something you wanted to do to kind of press policy going forward, you know, you need your lawyers from the White House and from the agencies to opine on those things. Can everybody hear me in the back? Perfect, okay, great. So I know Bruce mentioned a little bit of what my work was at the White House. I'd like to expand a little bit on that just to give you a sense of what exactly it was that I did. So the first 4.5 years that I spent in DC, I worked at the Office of Management and Budget. Who here has heard of OMB? Okay. So that's about 20, 30 hands. And so that's actually about 20 or 30 more hands than I would typically see when I'm speaking to folks. So that's a really good sign. That means that folks are actively engaged in advocacy and have been heavily involved with the federal government. So for those of you who don't know OMB, it's kind of a mixed bag for you because first you haven't had to deal with what many folks in the government call the bottleneck or the place where certain policies sometimes go to die is kind of how we're painted in the more negative sense. But my experience there was really what taught me what the federal government was about. It was really the place where you can see kind of across every single cabinet agency, and you can really understand the process of how both policy and budget is made across the federal government. And it was funny because about a month before I started interning at OMB, I actually had almost no idea what OMB did. And in fact, about 6 months into my work at OMB, I was still learning so much on a daily basis that I only had half an understanding of what OMB did. And the reason for that is that every single document, policy document, budget document, you name it, anything that's going public or going to Congress, it has to first go through the Office of Management and Budget for review to make sure, first and foremost, it's legal and that it follows regulation. But most importantly, that it follows and supports the president's priorities. So that is a very important role that OMB holds. And it's also the institutional knowledge of the federal government in many ways. They are a White House office. However, unlike most White House offices, it's primarily career employees, meaning that folks there kind of span different administrations, Republican, Democratic. It doesn't matter. They have decades and decades of knowledge about what's happened across past policy processes, what the budget environment has looked like over time. They have all of this knowledge, which many folks who come in newly into government as a political appointee, meaning somebody who comes in with a specific president and leaves with that specific president, the folks at OMB have a knowledge which is indispensable in the federal government. And so despite the fact that OMB definitely has its pros and cons when it comes to reputation, I can recount countless times when I was at the White House and would meet with folks who were trying to get a policy across the finish line, and they have a federal partner at the agency who's trying to get that policy across the finish line. And of course, when they come to see us, what do they say the federal official told them? They told them, OMB is blocking it. OMB is holding it. And so we became this kind of not just bottleneck, but almost the folks who were constantly being kind of given the blame for not having things move along. But they do serve that role where they have to ensure that everything that comes through, everything that goes through the process is something that we want to release. And so that's really where I learned about federal government. I worked across a very, very diverse range of issue areas. I started with tribal legislative policy. I moved along to international affairs budgeting, which took me to Afghanistan, Iraq. I did national security issues. So that was a very, very interesting experience for me. And I also had the opportunity to work on energy issues. So over the 4.5 years that I worked at OMB, I think I literally worked with every single cabinet agency in a very in-depth way, and also with a huge number of the independent agencies that exist across the government. So it was, despite the fact that OMB has a mixed reputation, it was one of the best experiences I've had in government, as it taught me everything that I knew in the foundation that I was able to bring to my next position at the White House, which I just exited a couple of months ago. And that was the Intergovernmental Affairs Office. I'm assuming that many folks here don't know what the Intergovernmental Affairs Office is. It's another one of those offices whose title doesn't really reveal much about their role. When I first heard the name, I thought, oh, this is the International Affairs Office. They do nation-to-nation work outside of the government. That is not true. So the Intergovernmental Affairs Office is actually responsible for managing the state, local, and tribal government relationship with the federal government. And so my responsibility in particular was to manage the relationship between the federal government and 567 federally recognized tribes across the country. And in addition to that, I also had tribal stakeholders. So that means tribal organizations, Alaska Native corporations, intertribal organizations, and just individuals as well. So it was a pretty broad portfolio. And on top of that, I would also work on Arctic issues, climate change issues, and a variety of other things. And I would never regret those 2.5 years. They were, some of the best years of my life because of the work that I was able to do there. In particular, I was able to essentially create entirely new initiatives, which had never existed before. One of those initiatives that I'm most proud of is Generation Indigenous. Who's heard of Generation Indigenous here? Okay, a few folks. Great. Liz has, I know that. So Generation Indigenous was the president, or is the president's Native Youth Initiative. He is, I believe, the only president in history to ever have a Native Youth Initiative. And it's a really interesting kind of side story how that initiative came to be. I actually had the opportunity to organize the president's first trip to Indian country, to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. And on that trip, the president and the first lady, they love talking to kids. They love talking to young people and having very frank discussions. The reason they like that so much is because young people tend to speak without an agenda. And they like to have that conversation and hear that kind of authentic viewpoint. And so when they decided to go to Standing Rock, we set up a meeting with the president and the first lady and 6 young people in this very small elementary school classroom, very intimate environment. No one else was allowed in the room. And they had a conversation with these young kids. And it's really incredible how much the voices of young people can have an impact on folks. The president and the first lady clearly deal with a lot of different issues, very serious issues on a daily basis. They hear some pretty terrible things. And you would assume, after how many years had it been at that point, 6 years, that they would have developed some sort of, desensitized skin, that they wouldn't be able, to penetrate with the words of these young people. That was not true at all. It was, in fact, the opposite. The week after we went out on that trip, the president actually called a few of us into the West Wing, into the Roosevelt Room. And I was about 5 or 6 months in this new job, so, I didn't know him well. And I found myself sitting there across from him in the Roosevelt Room, and he started to talk about these stories of these young people. They were stories of suicide, they were stories of homelessness, a lot of substance abuse, broken families. And a lot of this, we know through statistics. We know that it exists, but it's very different to hear it from the mouths of young people who are experiencing these things when they shouldn't have to. And so as he sat there across from me, he started tearing up and he started crying. And that was one of those moments that I will never forget in my life, is that the words of these young people could bring the leader of the free world to tears. And that's also the moment when I realized that he was on our side, that the president really not only supported tribal issues and what we're trying to achieve, but he really felt deeply about the issues that we cared about. And so that was really the starting point of Generation Indigenous. And again, one of the proudest things that I've had the opportunity to work on at the White House was helping to create that initiative, which is now thriving, and even here in Alaska and all the way across the country, in Maine, Florida, we have young people who are participating in this initiative, which the First Lady and the President are both very, very connected to. And of course, one of the other wonderful experiences which I had, which Bruce mentioned earlier, was the ability to organize the president's trip to Alaska and to bring him up here and kind of take him around our state. That was one of the most incredible experiences I've had in my life, in my career. I'm sure probably the most incredible experience I will ever have in my career, most likely. But being in that office and having that opportunity was just really incredible. So that's a little bit of an overview of what my federal service looked like. And I just kind of wanted to give you guys more flavor for what it was that I was doing out in DC. And beyond all of that, I am 100% an Alaska girl through and through. As mentioned, I grew up kind of all over Alaska. I grew up in the Mat-Su Valley, Kenai Peninsula, Bristol Bay, Lake Iliamna. My parents really liked to move for some reason. I'm not really sure why. Maybe they thought it was a character builder or something. But for me, when I was younger, I thought it was a bit of a pain, having to kind of rebuild your friendship base, get used to a new school, get used to a new environment. But as I kind of reflect on those days and having had that multidimensional experience, it's really helped me to become who I am today. Is what I've learned. And like many of the folks here in the audience, of course, I spent my summers in my mother's native village, Pedro Bay on Lake Iliamna, spending time with my parents and my grandparents, aunts and uncles, like 100 cousins probably. The whole family. It's a family affair. And it was those days which really kind of grounded my childhood, because that was the predictable factor. And that was also when I got to spend the most time with my grandparents and learn about what their values were, learn our traditions, learning to cut fish with an ulu, or a vashla as we call it in my language. But also learning about the values that defined my grandparents' generation, in which they've passed down to my parents and which have been passed down to me. Things like respect for your elders, respect for your community, respect for animals and the environment. And my grandparents used to reminisce quite a bit, actually, about the old days, about how the communities used to be more cohesive, and everybody kind of lifted each other up, everybody supported each other, because that's what you had to do to create and sustain a healthy community. And my grandpa was actually one of the last traditional leaders of my village. And leadership in his age was a little bit different. Leadership for him meant that he was the one responsible for ensuring that everyone had what they needed to survive. If a family had a poor hunting or fishing year, and others had a better year, he was responsible for ensuring that folks knew about it and that those people were taken care of. That was really leadership back then. It wasn't really a designated position, it's more the person who ensures that everyone is cared for and everyone has what they need to survive. But of course, those days weren't all sort of this romanticized version of society. Those days also had great struggle, which my grandparents would also talk about. If you have a poor hunting or fishing year, you're going to go hungry. If you don't have heating oil or wood, you're going to be cold. And of course, it was a time of transition as well. The cash economy was becoming much more prominent in the village. And both my grandparents actually ended up going into commercial fishing. And this was back in the days before we had motorized boats, called the sailboat days, which probably many of you have heard of, where folks commercial fished out of their sailboats and use only brawn, essentially, to make their living. And the reason I mention this is because it sheds light on the sacrifice and the adaptability that was needed for our very recent ancestors, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. It was not something they had chosen, but they realized that in order to survive and to ensure the well-being of their children and their children's children, that they had to adapt and evolve while also taking their traditions and their culture with them. And so it's interesting for me to reflect, and I do this every so often, but it's interesting for me to reflect on kind of where my family was a generation ago, living a subsistence lifestyle, speaking Diné Athabascan as the primary language, having a semi-nomadic way of life, to where I currently am, living in Washington, D.C., working at the White House, now kind of starting my own business. Oftentimes I'll think about how I ended up here. And people will actually ask me this. They'll ask me, how was it that you ended up, went from this point A to point B? And of course, this is something that didn't happen in a vacuum. It's something that happened because of the sacrifice, again, of my predecessors, of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my ancestors, because the struggle wasn't just in the past couple of generations. It was generations before that as well. Folks always had to fight to survive. Folks always had to do what they could to ensure that their children would have a better life than they did and have more opportunity than they did. And it really speaks to their resilience and to their ability to be adaptable for the good of their children. For instance, my maternal grandparents, when they were living in Pedro Bay, their children were getting a little bit older. They were advancing in school. There weren't great educational options available to them in the village at that time. And so they made the decision, with their 9 children in tow, to leave Pedro Bay and to move to Anchorage. This is a very common story that I'm sure many folks can relate to as well. They left the village, they went to Anchorage. My maternal grandparents, of course, had 0 formal education or training. They couldn't read or write. And so going into an environment like Anchorage was clearly very difficult, and there were very few opportunities for them in that environment. But they did what they had to do. My grandpa became a janitor. My grandma was a housekeeper. And with their 9 children, they supported them, and they ensured that they had everything that they needed to survive and to achieve a high school education. You know, back then, my grandparents, devoid of any education whatsoever, a high school education was a really big deal for them. And they enabled all of their kids to get that high school education. They gained literacy, they had opportunities out of that education, and it was worth it for my grandparents to have made that sacrifice to leave everything they knew, their home, their lifestyle, their family and their friends, the only life they'd ever known, essentially. And it's interesting because none of my mother and none of her siblings actually went to college or earned a college degree. Same thing on my father's side as well. And I oftentimes wonder why that is. And I think it goes back to what I mentioned, that even a high school education in my parents' generation was a huge deal. That was much more than my grandparents had achieved. And when it came to a higher education beyond that, college, there was just a complete and utter lack of knowledge about what that was and what that meant. There were no mentors, there was no guidance. There was no one who'd done that before. They didn't know where to find information, which schools were available. It just didn't really exist. And so that, as I said, there's a parallel on my father's side as well, where essentially the same thing happened. And so it goes back again to this difference that a generation makes, or less than a generation in this case. For my grandparents with little to no education, to me standing here today, I was very fortunate to have earned 2 Ivy League degrees and to have worked in various capacities at the White House. And again, I go back to this question that folks often ask me, which I'd mentioned earlier, about how it was that I ended up where I am today. And I used to struggle with this question quite a bit because I was looking for the one particular thing that enabled me to kind of, reach the position that I'm currently in. And I realized over time that was actually the wrong question. I think the correct question is actually, what are the factors, multiple, that have influenced my ability to be where I am today? I think one of the major factors goes back to the sacrifice and the resilience of my parents, my grandparents, my ancestors, who fought day after day to ensure that their children and the next generation had more opportunity than they had. Secondly, encouragement from my parents. My parents, despite not having a college education, were incredibly committed. The question was never if you'll go to college. It was, where are you going to college? And so they really set that standard for all of their children, all 5 of us, that you will be going to college. There was no question about it, despite the fact that they didn't have their own experience to draw upon. They knew that it was important. And third, and also very important, is information. My parents had very little information and very few resources to lean on when it came to looking at even pursuing a college education. But for me as a young person, kind of growing up all over the state and also having exposure to Anchorage and the outlying locations, I had experience with the Tsiri Foundation, Cook Inlet Tribal Council, different tribal organizations, all of which were pushing college education. Not only how do you apply, but how do you pay for this? Where can you go? How do you work this process? And as I think about the 45th anniversary of ANCSA, which is the theme of today's conference, I can see a very direct link between that law and where I am today. These institutions, many of them, are either the direct or indirect result of ANCSA. They've created this immense amount of information for young people to draw upon, which helps us get to where we need to go. And of course, there are differing opinions about ANCSA, some positive, some negative. The economic development impacts have been wonderful, but we also oftentimes struggle with securing our rights to hunt and fish for subsistence purposes. We also struggle, as I've seen very, very closely, with a lot of federal misinformation. A lot of folks at the federal level just have a very thin understanding of what Alaska is, who Alaska Native people are, and it's very difficult to try to understand the political and legal differences between our Alaska Native system versus the system in the lower 48. It's much simpler, I think, in the lower 48 in many ways. You have some treaty tribes, you have all these large tribes that are federally recognized, and they control the economic drivers in their communities. And so it's kind of very easy to look at these single entities, whereas here in Alaska, of course, as we all know, we have a very complicated system. And it's not necessarily the federal government's fault that folks don't understand this, but it can definitely get very discouraging when you have to always explain and re-explain and then re-explain again because folks have a very low base knowledge and because the folks who are in government aren't always in government, right? For decades and decades, they tend to kind of come and go, and it's a whole re-education process. And I know that because I spent 7.5 years educating folks on ANCSA and on our situation here in Alaska. But that said, President Obama's administration has certainly made some pretty incredible strides when it comes to his work on Alaska. We, of course, have the Arctic Council chairmanship currently. And with that, he signed an executive order on Arctic coordination, which created this very large interagency body called the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. It's headed by a friend of mine, Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, who is essentially the person responsible for ensuring that the federal government is focusing appropriately on the Arctic. And so this is something that's never really existed before. And when we say the Arctic domestically, of course, we mean Alaska. And so it's been incredible to see the work that's come out of that process. The Glacier Conference was part of that process. The president's trip even could be considered part of that process. And so it's really helped to heighten Alaska's standing in the federal government and on the national scale. And I think really helped us to sort of share the issues that we're experiencing here in the state, whether it be budget issues or issues related to climate change, which clearly is a huge issue for many folks across the state. And so in my work in politics, across the board, it's been an incredible experience and one that I wouldn't trade for anything. But as the president always says, we have a lot more to do. We really do. With the impacts of climate change especially, it's become even more important that we as Alaska Natives have representation in Washington, D.C., that we start to play more in national politics. Because times have changed, we can't always rely on our congressional representatives to get past the finish line the policy that we need to be enacted. And the president, of course, has seen this firsthand because he's had a Congress which hasn't been incredibly friendly towards his administration over the past 8 years. And so he's had to be very innovative and very creative when it comes to what they work on the administrative side. When you can't rely on federal legislation as an option to forge policy, you look inward to the executive branch and you decide, what is it that we can do? What authorities do we possess that we can use creatively to ensure that we can get some of this work done? And that spans across multiple different issues: climate change, immigration. Across the board, we've used executive power in very creative ways, which have helped a lot of different people. And so when folks talk about, how do we secure this national profile? How do we ensure that Alaska and Alaska Natives have a seat at the table, that we are more national players? And it's a great question, and it's one that I've thought about quite a bit, especially as Bruce mentioned, in my work for the Hillary campaign, it doesn't come naturally to every campaign or every federal official to think about Alaska. We're way up here, and folks oftentimes have never made a trip up here. We're not always able to travel down to D.C. to advocate for the issues that we care about. And so they oftentimes just tend to sort of fall by the wayside. And I think one of the ways, or one of several ways, that we can actually help in this process is by being more coordinated. And I know this is very difficult to do in many ways, and it's something that we've been trying to do more and more across different corporations and different tribal groups. But what I often see in Washington, D.C. is that folks will come to the table from the same region even with very differing views and opinions on what should happen. Now, kind of looking at the current kind of low levels of understanding and misinformation that already exist about Alaska among the federal government, this just helps to kind of confuse the situation further. And folks are even less likely to lean into and pay attention to our issues when we aren't coming with a more united front. The other issue that I've seen very, very clearly over the past few months is that it's much more difficult for Alaska Native tribal interests and governments to sort of lean in to national politics, things like fundraising and that sort of thing, because unlike tribes in the lower 48, especially those with a lot of resources, through casino revenues or otherwise, we don't have the federally recognized tribal entity that has commercial interests themselves. It's all kind of vested in the corporations. And so our corporations aren't allowed to give to federal campaigns because it's illegal. And our tribes mostly have federal and state money. And so it's really kind of, unlike tribes in the lower 48 who can give vast amounts to different campaigns, we oftentimes get kind of overshadowed a little bit because we don't have a mechanism to sort of exercise our political power in campaigns all the time. There are some ways to work around that, but some are more effective than others. And I think the other thing that really is helpful is having more Alaskans in D.C. I know everybody, goes to D.C. when they have to. No one likes to stay very long. I have many friends who've come to D.C. and left and kind of come back and left. And it's always great to have folks for whatever period of time we can, because I can't tell you how impactful it's been to be able to bring my Alaskan perspective into the White House. And that's had immense effects because it trickles down through the agencies and it becomes more a part of the institutional knowledge of all federal staff. And so I'm very proud of my time that I've spent there, and I sincerely hope that we can get others to DC as well, or working for the federal government here in Alaska, because it is, I can't even stress how important it is, especially as we struggle with climate change. We have communities that are literally falling into the ocean. The president actually flew over Kivalina, which is one of them, when he was up here last year. And, as we continue to be at the front lines of climate change impacts, we really need to think about how do we ensure that we continue to advocate in a really powerful way. In the President's Final Tribal Nations Conference the other week, and I'll wrap up here in just a second, but in the President's Final Tribal Nations Conference remarks, he stressed the importance of continuing to press on as Native people. He said, "Lasting progress depends on all of us, on our willingness to organize and mobilize and keep pushing for opportunity." And that really resonates with me because none of the work the Obama administration has accomplished for Native peoples would have been even remotely possible, not even a fraction of it, had we not had the active cooperation of tribal peoples and governments from across this country. And so my hope is that, as this administration comes to a close and the next administration comes to fruition, that we will continue to have that outsized impact and continue to fight for the needs of our people. So with that, thank you very much.